Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my colleagues have been down on the Senate floor for the last hour talking about the world that the Biden-Harris administration left us in terms of national security. And it's a really important topic. It's a much more dangerous world. And it also impacts not just what's going on globally, but at home as well. Particularly in a state like mine, where the Biden-Harris administration has literally been at war with Alaska because we have a lot of resources. Now you're thinking, well, why would that happen? So when you're governing, as this administration demonstrated to the American people and Alaskans, you make choices. You make choices. President Biden's choices involved, do you support hardworking Alaskans, particularly in the energy sector? Or do you support anti-American dictators, particularly when it relates to America's energy, Madam President? And the choices, unfortunately, in the last 4 years is when this administration was thinking about, hey, where do I get my energy? Americans need energy, our allies need energy, particularly after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We told all our allies, hey, get off Russian oil and gas. Okay? Where should we get it? Well, we should get it from places like Alaska, hardworking Alaskans, not from dictators like in Venezuela or Iran. But the choice that this president made almost every time, Madam President, was about selecting dictators over Americans, over Alaskans when it comes to energy. Now, this is particularly true as it relates to the policy the Biden-Harris administration undertook with regard to Iran. Think about what they inherited. The Trump administration's Iran policy was very effective. What was it? Number one, maximum pressure on the Iranian energy sector. When President Trump took office, under the Trump administration's sanctions, Iran's oil exports were reduced in 2020 to about 200,000 barrels a day from 2.7 million barrels a day. This was crushing them. Their foreign reserves, Iranian foreign reserves, went to about $4 billion in foreign reserves by the end of the Trump administration. That's not a lot at all. This was working. The Trump administration's policies in the Middle East, particularly as it relates to Iran, also involved taking out the world's #1 terrorist, Soleimani. By the way, a lot of people now commend President Trump for that. I remember the classified hearing we had here in the Senate right after that happened. So many of my Senate Democrat colleagues were criticizing Mike Pompeo and others for killing General Soleimani, which was a huge gift to countries around the world because he was the #1 terrorist in the world. And of course, the Trump administration launched the Abraham Accords. The presiding officer and I went to a number of the Abraham Accord countries together prior to the October 7th attacks, where the opportunities for peace had been growing prior to the October 7th attacks. So that was the Trump administration's policies with regard to Iran and energy. What did they do when the Biden administration came in? They made choices, Madam President, and the choices were to appease Iran. The choices were to lift sanctions on the Iranian oil and gas sector. When they lifted these sanctions over the last 4 years, this has dramatically enriched Iran. They almost have $100 billion in oil revenues now. Again, choosing dictators over Americans and Alaskans. And of course, Iran, what did they use this money for? To train and equip and supply the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. So, Madam President, what happened domestically? I'll tell you what happened domestically. In my state, the great state of Alaska, that's got minerals and oil and gas for our nation, for our allies, for Alaskans, in huge abundance. the Biden-Harris administration came in and they said, we're going to shut down Alaska. We're going to lock up Alaska. We are going to prefer energy from our adversaries than from our own country. And that's what they did. 68 executive orders and executive actions in the last 4 years, 68 exclusively focused on shutting down my state. I don't think there's ever been a federal government that focused on one state to crush them more than the Biden administration did to the great state of Alaska. So, Madam President, as I mentioned, this is all about choices. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago saying the Biden-Harris administration sanctions Alaska more than it sanctions Iran. It sanctions hardworking Alaskans more than it sanctions the terrorists in Iran. That is a fact. That's what's happened when you have an administration that goes on bended knee all over the world, Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, begging for oil, when you're shutting it down in our own country, particularly in my state. So, Madam President, this is what we got. 4 years of this, sanctioning a state, sanctioning my constituents, when the president goes on bended knee to Venezuela, to Iran, and won't sanction them at all. Does that make sense? No. But that's the world that we watched and dealt with over the last 4 years. I am quite confident that the incoming Trump administration is not going to do that anymore. Stand by, Iran. Maximum sanctions are coming back your way. Maximum pressure is coming back your way. And I'm also very confident that the Trump administration, with a Republican Senate and a Republican House, is going to help the state of Alaska, which has more critical minerals and oil and gas than almost any place in the world, to once again produce for the benefit of Alaskans, for the benefit of Americans, and the benefit of our allies. I yield the floor.